I'm Don Tess, better known as the Dawn of Beer.
And I'm Em Sauter, better known as Pints and Panels.
Welcome to episode 36 of the All About Beer podcast. Every 2 weeks, we talk with leading experts and take a deep dive into one topic in beer. This week on the show, we're going to talk about pasteurization. It's the unsung hero of beer quality and unfairly maligned. But first, visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And if you're feeling generous, please visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer to support this show and others. So, we used to always nag our listeners all the time to like and subscribe our show, but we kind of stopped doing that.
Yeah, it really helps us out, but people really don't like being nagged, so I get it.
Okay, so we won't nag, but we can still drop hints.
You should like and subscribe.
Yes, please like and subscribe. Okay, Em, what are your thoughts on pasteurization?
Well, some people believe that pasteurization affects the flavor of beer, but I've heard a few studies that did a blind triangle test where people couldn't tell which beers were pasteurized and which were not. So it's not really clear that pasteurization really does affect flavor.
Yeah, I'm guessing that maybe pasteurization techniques have improved, like maybe before it did affect flavor, but now there's better knowledge, better science, better techniques. So maybe the negative stigma is carried over from before, but I actually don't know. This is why we have the show, and this is why we have experts. So I'm looking forward to find out.
Me as well.
If you would like to help support the All About Beer podcast, please reach out to podcast@allaboutbeer.com. Speaking of supporting the show, here's a word from our sponsors.
Malt Europe Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malt Europe Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malt Europe Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurope.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order. Estrella Galicia, where brewing excellence has been a family tradition since 1906. Today, the fifth generation proudly continues the brewery's legacy. Immerse yourself in the rich taste of Galicia with its traditional family recipe, brewed consistently with the same authentic ingredients and methods. Trust them to deliver traditional flavor that's like no other every single time. Estrella Galicia is all about lager, rooted in German brewing heritage. Maintaining its commitment to tradition, they brew exclusively in their brewery in La Coruña. Each beer boasts its own distinctive recipe. No shortcuts, no compromises. Their passion for beer sets them apart as they embrace and celebrate the art of brewing. At Estrella Galicia, they love beer above all things. Experience the difference, sip by sip.
Keith Villa, Ph.D., is a trailblazer in the beer and cannabis industries and brewmaster and co-founder of Colorado-based CERIA Brewing Company, dedicated to brewing only alcohol-free beers. After earning his Ph.D. in brewing from the University of Brussels in Belgium in the early 1990s, an honor only a handful of brewers have achieved, Keith returned to the United States with the idea of crafting beers inspired by Belgian styles, but with a twist. He began his 32-year career as founder and head brewmaster at Blue Moon Brewing Company, an operating unit of MillerCoors. Since retiring from Blue Moon, this beer doctor developed a patented brewing method to produce great-tasting alcohol-free craft beers, written a book titled Brewing with Cannabis, using THC and CBD in beer, and continues to speak worldwide as an expert in both the beer and cannabis industries. Welcome to the show, Keith.
Hi, Don. Thanks for having me on.
So very first, the very, very basics, what exactly is pasteurization?
Well, to get right into it, pasteurization is where you physically heat a product for a certain amount of time in order to stabilize it against the growth of various types of microorganisms.
Okay.
And we're done for the day. Thank you.
So when when people get into beer, they learn that beer was safer than water, historically speaking, because it's boiled during manufacture. So, why is pasteurization necessary at all? Like, I thought beer was supposed to be safe.
Well, it turns out that beer in general is safe, and you're absolutely right. From a historical perspective, when, for example, the ancient Egyptians or the Sumerians, when they made beer, it was a low alcohol beer, but there was enough alcohol in it to act as a preservative and to inhibit the growth of pathogenic microorganisms. So, in other words, beer was created a long time ago. This is according to one theory, to make water safe to drink because so many water sources were polluted, whether naturally or man-made pollution. They were polluted to the point where drinking the water would make people physically sick, or worse, it could kill people in some certain circumstances. So when you put the conditions together to turn that water into a beer. And the beers back then wouldn't have looked anything like today's beers. They would have been cloudy, most likely sour, and they just would have tasted different, but it would have been nutritious and it would have been safe to drink.
Um, I just want to say cloudy and sour actually does sound like a lot of beers today. But
Oh, yeah.
anyways.
You're right.
Fair, fair.
But so then in modern day, why is pasteurization necessary again if there's alcohol in it?
So one reason that brewers pasteurize their beer is to stabilize it so it has a longer shelf life. Because beer, as all of us know, good craft beer is best when it's fresh. And as it sits on a shelf and ages in a package, it can deteriorate somewhat rapidly depending on the conditions. But if you really want to extend that shelf life and minimize changes and minimize potential growth of brewery bacteria such as lacto, you do need to pasteurize it. And so some brewers typically pasteurize their beers, their alcohol-containing beers, so that they have an extended shelf life of anywhere from 9 months to a year and a half. Some even tout a 2-year shelf life after pasteurization. And of course, they're talking mainly about physical stability. When we talk about flavor stability, most beers will start changing at about 6 months, 9 months, but you can minimize those changes by pasteurizing. And certainly pasteurization will minimize the growth of brewery bacteria like lacto, which if that's present in a bottle or can of beer, it will lead to souring of the beer. And in certain cases, it can lead to some physical changes in the beer, things like making the beer become very viscous and creating a funny sour milk taste if it's lacto. And there are lots of other brewery microorganisms that can get in to change the characteristics of the beer in ways that consumers generally do not like.
I see.
So there are different types of pasteurization. I know there's flash, there's tunnel, is there like bath as well? So what are those? And then what are the pros and cons of each of them? And if I forgot any of them, I'm sure there are other ways to heat beer or however. But yeah, give us how pasteurization is done in the different types, please, and thank you.
Okay, so from a brewery perspective, there are two main types of pasteurization. There's flash pasteurization and tunnel pasteurization. So flash pasteurization, if I can explain it in a way for your listeners to understand, the beer is sent through a series of pipes where it gets heated up to a certain temperature called a kill temperature, and it's maintained at that temperature for a certain amount of time, and then it goes through the pipes backwards to cool it down, and then it goes into a bright beer tank or a packaging tank where it's ready to be used in packaging. Flash pasteurization is generally used for kegged product because you can't put a keg in a tunnel pasteurizer once it's full. They're just physically too big to fit in a standard brewery pasteurizer. So generally, keg product is flash pasteurized if a brewer chooses to pasteurize it. And then the other type of pasteurizer is a tunnel pasteurizer. And some of us have seen these in the larger breweries, and there are some large regional craft breweries that have these operational. And what these are they're pasteurizers that look almost like a tunnel. The beer goes in one end on a conveyor belt and comes out the other end, and it goes in very slowly. And this is after packaging. So after the cans or the bottles are filled and crowned, then they start their slow journey through this pasteurizer. And the tunnel pasteurizer generally has 6 to 8 what are called zones. And in these zones, they have spray jets where it sprays water onto the package as it's moving underneath the jets. And the first couple of zones heat the product up gradually. So from room temperature, up to a certain point, and then the goal is to get it up to the kill temperature, and then you hold it there as it's going through this tunnel slowly on a conveyor belt. Everything is worked out so that it stays. The first couple zones get it up to the temperature, and then it stays under the sprays to keep it at that kill temperature for the required amount of time. And then the last couple of zones have spray nozzles that spray water that is cooler and cooler, so that the product is gradually cooled down. And then it exits the pasteurizer, and then and there's a lot of steam and water involved in this. And so in essence, at the end of the tunnel pasteurizing process, you do need to get rid of a lot of the water on the packages. So you have typically what are called air blades or air sprayers to really wipe off all that excess moisture and dry out the cans or the bottles, and then send them off to the packaging area for placement into 6-packs or mother cartons or what have you. So those are the two types of pasteurizing. Again, in summary, there's tunnel pasteurizing, which we just talked about. And then there's flash pasteurizing. Tunnel, again, is used for cans and bottles. Flash is generally used for kegged product.
Do you have a preference over which one you prefer?
My preference is tunnel pasteurizing because tunnels, to me, it really helps with the worrying part as a brewer. You always worry about your product being out in the marketplace, and it gives you a sense of relief if it's been tunnel pasteurized, because as it's filled in the cans and bottles, in my experience, and I think if you talk to quite a few brewers, you will see that a lot of them agree that the majority of contamination in beer products occurs at the filler. So when you're canning or bottling, a lot of the contamination will occur right there at the filler. And so if you pasteurize into a tank, and then you've got sterile pasteurized beer, and then you feed that into the canning line, you'll find that you can get instances of contamination of your product. Even in kegs, you will find some kegs that go bad because of contamination, and that's because contamination more often than not will occur at the filler. And so that's why, from my perspective, tunnel is the best, because then you've packaged the product into a can or bottle, you've pasteurized it without opening it, and that pasteurization, what it does is it raises that temperature to the kill zone, the kill temperature, and it keeps it there until you've demonstrated that any amount of bacteria that you generally see in that particular brewery that bacteria will be killed off. So the product will be safe. Again, nothing is 100% certain, but with a tunnel pasteurizer, you get pretty close.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask, what is the kill temperature and how long does it have to stay there?
So generally with pasteurization, what you talk about are PUs, pasteurization units. And one easy way to think of a PU is if you hold a can of beer at 140 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 minute. So,
Okay.
So that's equivalent to one PU, one pasteurization unit.
Okay.
But you have to get it up to that temperature. So a lot of people don't realize that you can't just put a can or a bottle at 140 because when we talk about pasteurization, the whole entire contents of that can or bottle has to be up to that temperature, and that is why you have these zones that are spraying in a tunnel pasteurizer, because they get the whole can and the contents in the can up to that required kill temperature. And if it's 140, then you keep it there at 140 degrees for the required number of minutes, so you have the right number of PUs. And again, I want to stress that 140 degrees for 1 minute is a PU, but you can pasteurize at higher temperatures for shorter amounts of time, and that's exactly what quite a few brewers do. Is if they've got a time schedule to meet for packaging, a lot of them will dial up the temperature and shorten up the pasteurization time. And the way you measure out is you use what are called pasteurization meters. What these are is they're quite expensive, typically around $3,000 to $5,000 for these things. But it looks like a little tray, kind of a tray with a little probe on it, and you put a can or a bottle in it, and you put the probe into the can or bottle, and obviously the can or bottle is filled, and what it does is it measures the temperature and the time going through the pasteurizer, so that you know what the exact PUs are. So your PU meter, you always run your pasteurization with a meter so that you get an exact readout of the PUs that the product has been exposed to. And even then, I've simplified that quite a bit, because prior to doing that, there's a lot of lab work involved where you have your process authority will go through and determine what the main types of bacteria you're being exposed to are, and then do tests in the lab to inoculate cans or bottles at different levels with these microorganisms, and then use heat to kill it off. And then what you do is you simulate that in the big the tunnel pasteurizer. So it's a very complex subject, and in fact, there are process authorities who are complete experts on pasteurization of juices or beers or what have you. And if you're in the brewing industry, it's not always required, because there are so many craft brewers who don't need to pasteurize. But if you work for a larger brewery, on the packaging side, you will probably have to know quite a bit about pasteurization. And if you're a small brewer making specialty products that could go bad, you also need to learn about pasteurization so that you can stabilize the products. I'll give one real quick example. With you guys are familiar with the Great American Beer Festival, and back in my Blue Moon days, we used to win quite a bit of gold medals with our honey beers. And I formulated a honey beer to have a lot of honey flavor. And there are a lot of craft brewers out there who brew honey beers, but they put the honey into the kettle. And so it's fermented by the yeast. And by the very end of the process, a lot of times that type of honey beer, where the honey's added in the kettle, uh, loses a lot of the honey character. But if you put the honey in right before packaging, what you find out is a lot of that honey character is preserved, and you get the aroma, the taste of honey, not just sweetness, but honey. And but you also can end up with pretty severe contamination problems, because when you put honey in, the yeast will re-ferment it, or honey has contaminants in it, microorganisms that can actually start making the beer bad. So the only way to do that is to put the honey in and then pasteurize to stabilize it. And then you've got a product that, in our case, we ended up winning. It must have been 4 gold medals in the honey category and quite a few silver medals too. So, and it's all because you can play around with making products and stabilizing them so that they're award winning, and at the same time, they will last for a long time on the shelf and still taste really good.
Could you do that with like maple syrup or any kind of fermentable that would have
Exactly.
this?
Any type of fermentable. So, and as you know, if you put maple syrup into a brew in the kettle, a lot of times that really nice maple character gets boiled off. And you could add back a flavoring, but in my experience, flavorings for maple just taste terrible because if you overdo it, it tastes so artificial. But when you use natural maple syrup, the best way to do it is to put it in right before packaging and then pasteurize the product to lock in the stability. And then you've got a product that is really rich in maple aroma and taste, and potentially will win, quite a few medals in competitions.
So I wanted to ask, because I think a lot of people think pasteurization is a bad thing in terms of affecting the flavor. But what you're saying is that if it's used properly, it's a good thing. It keeps flavor, well, stable. Is that right? Do you think there's
You're,
an unfair negative stigma against pasteurization?
I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there with what quite a few craft brewers actually were talking about years ago, before they understood the critical aspects of pasteurization. And I think it's just a kind of an unfair generalization of big brewers, because quite a few big brewers do pasteurize to stabilize their products, and a lot of home brewers and craft brewers kind of got this thought that might be the cause of the low flavor or the lack of flavor, and in essence, what it does is it locks in what the brewer was trying to do. So if you're wanting to enjoy a Bud Light or a Coors Light, or a Miller Light, what the brewers typically would do is pasteurize. Although Coors products for the longest time were cold filtered. I believe if they're exported, they're pasteurized to stabilize them. But the other big brewers would pasteurize, and they would just lock in the flavor at that point. And of course, light beer is very low in flavor. And I think years ago, a lot of brewers just thought that pasteurization was wiping out the flavor. But in fact, it will stabilize everything to the point where, as we just talked about, if you want to make a delicious maple flavored beer, not sweet, but just with a hint of that really nice maple flavor, or a honey beer that has really nice honey sweetness. And I've experimented with alfalfa honey, clover honey, wildflower honey, orange blossom, any type of honey, many types, and that characteristic survives into the packaged product, and you won't get pasteurization or contamination if it's pasteurized. So you're right, Don, that it gives you that flexibility to make, to brew with almost any ingredient and not worry about contamination.
I'm thinking fruit as well might be a good use. Is that right?
Fruit is also another one that is good. But in that case, that's where you definitely have to have a good microbiologist on staff, because certain fruits we will have microorganisms that can really be hard to kill by pasteurization. And rather than the minimal amounts of PUs, you really have to use a lot to kill some of those organisms. For example, the big brewers, or actually any beer that's alcoholic, a good general way to think about pasteurizing those beers is they will have anywhere from about, I would say 12 to 25 PUs, which is very minimal. But when you're talking about juices, certain juices or beers made with juice, they can require hundreds, and in rare cases, low thousands of PUs
my.
to make sure that everything that's potentially hazardous is killed off. And you can imagine that if you hold the beer at that temperature for that much time, it can be detrimental to the flavor of the beer. So that's why with some fruits, it is better to add them in the kettle or add them at a point where there's plenty of alcohol to ward off and inhibit the growth of any type of pathogens.
So I have a question that I know is going to sound silly, but hopefully you can tell me why it's silly. Let's say I've listened to you, Keith, and I think, oh yes, pasteurization is awesome. I have this new can of honey beer that I just purchased from my favorite brewery, and I know that they don't pasteurize. Can I, as a consumer, take it home and put it in a bath of water at 140 degrees and have it sit there at 140 degrees for a few minutes and pasteurize it myself at home?
That's possible, but you have to be aware of certain things. For example, they may not have packaging that can withstand pasteurization. So, for example, glass bottles. The glass bottles do have to be a little thicker than normal, and you have to be careful in adjusting that temperature upwards step by step. If you just thrust that bottle into a bath at 140, chances are it'll develop cracks and explode.
So don't do it. We'll just say don't.
Yeah.
It's best to trust the brewer and really talk to the brewery to see if they've done anything to minimize any issues, and if they haven't pasteurized, but the product is 6 or 7% ABV and has a good amount of hops, 15, 16 or more, chances are that product is safe to drink and probably pretty flavorful too.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to hearing more about pasteurizations, but first, here's a word from our sponsors.
Estrella Galicia, where brewing excellence has been a family tradition since 1906. Today, the fifth generation proudly continues the brewery's legacy. Immerse yourself in the rich taste of Galicia with its traditional family recipe, brewed consistently with the same authentic ingredients and methods. Trust them to deliver traditional flavor that's like no other every single time. Estrella Galicia is all about lager, rooted in German brewing heritage. Maintaining its commitment to tradition, they brew exclusively in their brewery in La Coruña. Each beer boasts its own distinctive recipe. No shortcuts, no compromises. Their passion for beer sets them apart as they embrace and celebrate the art of brewing. At Estrella Galicia, they love beer above all things. Experience the difference, sip by sip.
All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts.
Malt Europe Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malt Europe Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malt Europe Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurope.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order.
So before the break, we were kind of talking about how pasteurization, there is in some inherent safety in beer because of the hops, because of pH and alcohol content. Non-alcoholic beer, though, that's been growing in popularity. It's the fastest growing segment in beer. And I've recently been reading some reports that with non-alcoholic beer, because the pH is not as low and because there is essentially no alcohol, sometimes hopping rates are lower. Pasteurization is not just a good idea, but is necessary to make non-alcoholic beer safe. Is that true?
In my opinion, that's 100% true, Don. It's true because you can have two major issues with non-alcoholic beer that's packaged. The first is if even one brewer's yeast cell survives in the process and goes into packaging and gets into that can, it can re-ferment, or that is, it can start re-fermenting in the can. And then what you'll have is cans that bulge out and explode, or they'll slightly bulge out, but the contents inside is now alcoholic. And so we've seen some cases where some craft NA beer can be up to over 2% ABV. So the legal limit again is less than 0.5% ABV. So and we've seen some that are above that quite a bit. And of course, as a consumer, a lot of consumers want their NA beer to taste like regular beer. And if it's 2.5% ABV and they're thinking it's an NA, of course, a lot of people are going to say, "Wow, that tastes just like beer."
Because it is.
Because it is. I was just
exactly. And then the other more critical issue that can happen is that if someone on the filling line did not clean the line properly or went to the restroom and did not wash their hands properly, you could get pathogens infused into that filler and then have them end up in the can or the bottle. And by pathogens, I'm talking about things that can make a person sick or worse, can kill people. Things like E. coli, listeria, botulism, these type of things that have historically just been on the minds of all of our ancestors from the ancient times to now, because the last thing you want to do when you enjoy a meal or a beverage is to get sick from it or to watch one of your significant other get sick, and that's why we want to make sure that in the NA world we do as much as possible to eliminate that option of potentially having pathogens growing in your product.
Mm-hmm.
Does it matter how the NA beer is made? Like, some have alcohol removed. There's some people use a vacuum. Some people just brew it really low alcohol. Like, does making a regular beer and removing the alcohol mean the beer may be safer, or should all NA beer be pasteurized no matter what the process?
Yeah, it does not matter. All beer
Okay.
that's NA should be pasteurized because there's some folks out there who say, "Oh, but we have a high-tech reverse osmosis system that will get out anything," and it's like, okay, you've got a tank of NA beer that's been de-alcoholized, but now, since the majority of infections happens at that filler over there, you're now exposing it to contamination. And so, so that's why it all should be pasteurized. And then there are definitely a lot of instances where craft brewers use arrested fermentation or alternative types of yeast to make NA beers. And in that case, there are a certain amount of fermentable sugars that exist in the package. And in that case, those can start re-fermenting. So regardless of the technique for making the non-alcoholic beer, you've got to pasteurize to protect the integrity of the product, but more importantly, to protect those people who buy beers and consume them.
Yeah, nobody wants a lawsuit.
No.
Yeah.
What about chemical stabilizers? I've heard of some breweries maybe using that instead of pasteurization. Is that as effective? Does it change the flavor?
It can be effective. The only issue is that you will have flavor effects because there are some that are sodium and potassium based. And of course, if you put those in, you do have to label them. So it really brings a whole different twist to it. And then it also limits some of the places where you can sell your product, because some of the more, I would say, organic retailers like Whole Foods, they have a list of preservatives that if your product contains that, they will not sell your beer in their store. And then one of the more recent chemicals that people are using, at least in the wine world, is a chemical called Velcorin. And Velcorin is a very potent inhibitor of microorganisms. But that's also not allowed in Whole Foods because one of the byproducts of Velcorin is a very small amount of methanol, which is a poison. And then the other thing is that in the wine world, some of the wines that use Velcorin, they're not required to label it. So they basically have a free pass to use it and not label it. But if they want to sell in Whole Foods, they have to disclose it. And so a lot of them won't sell in Whole Foods. But Velcorin is one of those things that works well in wine because of the low pH. In beer, it will work in sour beers, but in regular beer, there are some brewers who are using it. I won't name any names, but there are some who are using it. But it is a little tricky because beer is at the pH where Velcorin is not quite at its peak activity. It's got to be in a real acidic solution, like acidity of wine, sour beer, certain juices, fruit juices. So if it's a very acidic environment, Velcorin will work nicely.
But it'll still produce that methanol, though, you're saying.
Correct. It'll still produce a very small amount of methanol, where some people say, well, it's negligible. But in my opinion, if you're wanting something as natural as beer, the last thing you want is something unnatural like methanol contaminating it.
In particular, breweries now are making hop water or craft sodas, and I've heard of smaller breweries holding their product to watch for pathogen growth or sending it to a third party for analysis to make sure that it doesn't have any pathogens. Are those viable options for those things? Could it be used for NA, or is the root of it just pasteurization is really the key you need?
With waters, if you have a process authority in your brewery that has gone through the process and really gives the thumbs up that the process is clean, that the product has the proper pH, and that you've sent samples out to reputable labs to analyze, it provides a certain amount of relief. again, nothing is 100%, but
Sure.
but if you've got your process really buttoned up and you have a process authority who has gone through everything with a fine-tooth comb and says, okay, this looks good, I'm satisfied, then in that case, it should be fine. But realize that in the last month, there have been, actually 2 months, I think, there have been 2 articles that have been published on NA beer and actually low alcohol, non-alcohol, and alcohol-free beer. And these articles, one was from Cornell University, but they talk about the different experiments that they've done. And the thing that stands out is if something is in the beer, like say there's E. coli in there, that E. coli may not grow, but it may be in there waiting for the right conditions to grow. So if the temperature warms up, or if the pH somehow goes up a little bit, then it's possible that that will start growing and eventually make people sick. So that's why in the world of NA products, you really need some expertise to protect the integrity of the product. But again, I always go back to our customers. If they trust in you to buy your product off the shelf, you as the supplier should make sure to give them the best product that's consumable without any worries of getting sick.
Right. I've read a couple of those articles that you're referring to, and they were, kind of eye-opening for me, to be honest. But I personally haven't heard any reports of people getting sick from unpasteurized non-alcoholic beer. So is the risk overblown, or have we just been really lucky so far that nobody's gotten sick? Or have people been getting sick and we just don't know it?
I think that might be the case. Your last issue might be, or your last statement might be the case, because let's see, the Cornell article was referenced in Men's Journal a couple weeks ago. They published an article. The title was something along the lines of this. It said something, "Is your NA beer making you sick?" And
Oh,
Oh, that's a real
yeah.
and really the whole position of the article was the fact that NA beer might be what makes you sick every now and then, whereas most people probably never had a clue that that could be it, because they just associate food poisoning with
Yeah.
going and eating a bad taco or something,
Yeah.
and
Or they think it's the 7 shots of vodka they had before the non-alcoholic beer. Just
right.
kidding.
But they really associate food poisoning with food, because we even in the name, food poisoning,
Right.
a lot of people don't realize that you can get sick from beverages, and in fact, a lot of people in the industry point to the juice industry. And in particular, there was a company in Boulder, Colorado, that was making juices. They prided themselves, and I don't want to name their name, but they prided themselves on non-pasteurized juice. And the reason they did not pasteurize was because they said that pasteurization ruins the flavor and the nutritional content of their juices. And they were warned several times. And in fact, they had different breakouts of different microorganisms over time. But eventually it did catch up with them to the point where I believe they, in the late 1990s, they put out a batch of apple juice that was not pasteurized, and it ended up killing a young girl and made a lot of people sick. I believe up to 30 or 40 people, maybe a little more, got sick from that batch. But the authorities were able to trace it back to that contaminated apple juice. And of course, after that, they started pasteurizing.
Mhm.
So my philosophy is, let's not wait for a tragic event to happen. Let's make sure, since we have the science available to us at our fingertips, let's use it as an industry and make sure that our products are safe. Because every now and then I'll go on the non-alcoholic forums. For example, on Facebook, there's one. And when a brewer comes out with a new non-alcoholic beer, Sometimes they'll say it's not pasteurized, so you've got to keep it cold, keep it in the refrigerator. And a lot of times they'll also say pasteurization ruins the flavor of the beer. That's why we don't pasteurize. But in fact, what they're saying is that number one, they probably don't know how to pasteurize. And number two, they probably don't want to spend the money to pasteurize, because pasteurizing is expensive. Well, it adds to the cost of your product. And that's why a lot of folks don't want to pasteurize. But if they're making small batches of NA, in that case, sometimes I'll talk to small brewers and I'll say, if you don't want to invest in a tunnel pasteurizer, find a larger brewer who has a pasteurizer and do a contract batch over there. Or you can purchase a small, what's called a batch pasteurizer. They look like industrial dishwashers, and they mimic the effects of a tunnel pasteurizer. You load up the racks with cans, typically 48 or 72 cans. You press the buttons and it goes through the cycles almost like a dishwasher, and it takes the product up to the right temperature and then holds it there and then brings it down, and it pasteurizes. And those are effective, and they're small scale, and I think those things typically run about 25,000, so it's not going to break the bank of a craft brewer. And there's some craft breweries that can share one of those things. That's what we used to use when we were making infused cannabis beer, because the market was so small. We would just wheel that thing around and batch pasteurize every batch of cannabis beer, and it worked nicely.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Keith, thank you for educating us and for keeping us safe. I really appreciate that.
Yes.
If people want to follow you on social media or whatever, do you want to share your social media handles or maybe an email address?
Well, our daughter handles all the social media, so if you ask for a handle, all I know is we're on Instagram and all those things. But yeah, just look us up. Just Google CERIA Brewing Company, and you'll find the different social sites that we're on. Our daughter handles all that, and she actually does post a few times a year about the importance of pasteurization, and she'll even take pictures of our cans, because our cans, and that's one thing, Don and M, that your listeners should be pushing for is there should be some kind of a seal of pasteurization that brewers should use, to guarantee that their product at least has been pasteurized. What we're doing at CERIA is on every can we print on the shoulder, it says pasteurized for prolonged deliciousness.
Nice.
Taking some creative license with the wording there, but we do say that it's pasteurized, and there are some of our competitors who pasteurize it. I know they do, because I know they make quality products. People like Brooklyn Beer, Sam Adams, Athletic. Those are some that I will name, because I know they make high quality products, and they pasteurize to make sure their products are safe. They may not advertise it on their cans, but I know that they do, and so I will always call out good high quality products, but I think as an industry we really owe it to the consumers to have some kind of a stamp on our cans that says pasteurized, just so that people know that an NA product has been pasteurized and it's safe. But that's
Right.
my 2 cents.
Right. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Keith. I really appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thanks. It's been fun. And again, pasteurization, that's the key to safe, non-alcoholic and alcohol-free beer. It's my motto, always has been since the start of this industry just a few short years ago.
Wonderful. Cheers, Keith.
Cheers.
Okay, Em, what do you think of pasteurization now?
I think it's fascinating how you can use it for so many different things. I mean, it kills microorganisms, but it can really it can lock in flavor.
Yeah, stabilize the flavor.
Stabilize and actually
make it better.
improve and making it better. Like that's
Sorry,
my
I keep interrupting you.
but it's really exciting, and it's cool to see that, like, all the old school people, when they talk about pasteurization, like, it's cooked, burp, burp, burp. And like, no, do you like your honey beer or maple syrup? Or like brown sugar, any fermentable that you want to lock the flavor in, pasteurization is the key. And I had no idea that that was possible. So that's very cool stuff.
And it lets you add the adjunct in a different place. Like he was saying, instead of having to add the honey in the kettle and boil it, you can add it after, but you then have to pasteurize it. So
It's really,
I really like that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a really fascinating, like, extra way to use pasteurization in a different way. I mean, then there's so much the evolution of beer that maybe there's other ways that pasteurization can be explored that in like 5-10 years we haven't even thought about that we'll use. So it's cool stuff. Always,
Yeah.
it's always cool stuff.
I always love it. This is why I love hosting this show with you, Em. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And for the generous listeners, please visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer to support this show and others. If you have questions for the experts, please email podcast@allaboutbeer.com. That's also the email for feedback, suggestions, or to inquire about supporting this show through advertising. Em, how can people reach out to you?
I am at Pints and Panels across all social media, and my website is www.pintsandpanels.com. How about you, Don?
I am at the Dawn of Beer on X, Threads, and Instagram, and people can drop me an email at dawn@thedawnofbeer.com. Here's a word from our sponsor.
Malt Europe Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malt Europe Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malt Europe Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurope.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order. Estrella Galicia, where brewing excellence has been a family tradition since 1906. Today, the fifth generation proudly continues the brewery's legacy. Immerse yourself in the rich taste of Galicia with its traditional family recipe, brewed consistently with the same authentic ingredients and methods. Trust them to deliver traditional flavor that's like no other every single time. Estrella Galicia is all about lager, rooted in German brewing heritage. Maintaining its commitment to tradition, they brew exclusively in their brewery in La Coruña. Each beer boasts its own distinctive recipe. No shortcuts, no compromises. Their passion for beer sets them apart as they embrace and celebrate the art of brewing. At Estrella Galicia, they love beer above all things. Experience the difference, sip by sip.
This show is produced by All About Beer. Visit allaboutbeer.com for articles, notes on this show and others, and to connect via the newsletter and social media. Cheers.
Cheers, everyone.
Boil your beer. No, don't boil your beer.
Don't spoil your beer. Wait, you spoil your beer.